Good morning, everyone, for those of you who are in Brazil, and good afternoon for those who are in the UK and Ireland and whatever time it is that everyone else is. I'm Professor Rita Drumond, and it is my absolute pleasure to welcome you to the Quinta Jornada de Estudos Irlandeses Da Ufsc, the 5th edition of the annual event our Irish Studies Hub at the Universidade Federal de Santa Catarina has been hosting as part of our effort to promote Irish studies in the south of Brazil and beyond. I have been lucky that even before I defended my doctoral thesis at Universidade de São Paulo, I found at Ufsc my colleagues, Alinne and Beatriz, and we were soon galvanized to create this new institutional home for our research and teaching in Irish literature, theatre, and cinema. This event has been many years in the making. After all the preparation up to then, when the pandemic first went, when we had the first lockdown in Brazil, we had to postpone from our original November 2020 plans. I'm glad we are having it now, even if remotely, although that seems fitting considering the theme, which you'll hear more about from Alinne later on. Considering how much we've lost personally and as societies, particularly in Brazil, in this intervening year, I'm almost choked to see this happening at all and look forward, particularly to my supervisees' presentations throughout the day. I look back to our online group meetings in the first months of the pandemic as one of the few things I could count on. I'm very proud, and I have a dog here. Oh, sorry about that. I'm at my mom's because this looked nicer than the mess I'm currently living in. So I'm very proud of what we have achieved since we started May 5 or 6 years ago, was it, Alinne? So, and everything that our students have achieved. This is also an emotional event for me because I have since found a new institutional home. This September, I took up a new position at the Universidade Federal de Ouro Preto in my home state of Minas Gerais. I still retain very strong links with both postgraduate programs at Ufsc, if anything, because of all the said supervisees, but also because of what we've built here in our Irish Studies Hub. Called NEI, jokingly between Alinne and me. For all these reasons, this year's event is even more special for me, and rest assured, we have a very busy day, a proper journey ahead of us, with 2 lectures by our guest speakers from the UK and Ireland, 1 interview with the playwright Stacey Gregg, 4 student panels, and to start us off, the opening by His Excellency, the Ambassador of the Republic of Ireland in Brazil, Mr. Eoin Bennis, but I've messed that up as well. That's okay. Mr. Bennis, so sorry about this. It's wonderful. It's wonderful that you're here in Florianopolis right now, and we are very honored to have you officially open this event for us. General Consul. Sorry about that.
Thank you, Professor. The joys of sort of baby steps into hybrid events are, we don't have a dog in the room, but we have a couple of other internet connections. So I think we're good now. But no, thank you, Professor, and thank you for your kind words. I am the Consul General of Ireland here in Sao Paulo, and on my arrival here this morning, I said to both Fabio and Alinne that this is the earliest I've been to a meeting in a year and a half, because it's been from one Zoom to another Zoom. So for me, this is truly a special occasion as I make my first footsteps out into the great wide open that is Brazil, and out and beyond Sao Paulo. I guess I should start, if I can, by thanking and giving my warmest appreciation to Beatrice Kopsich-Bastos, who together with Alinne and Fabio, who are here literally in social distancing terms, 5 meters away, which is just so special, truly special. I don't have the words. Who have really guided what I have felt and understood to be a really wonderful team here at the Núcleo De Estudos Irlandeses, especially with such great strength and character and direction and vision during what has been an absolutely challenging year, as you just mentioned. Thank you also for the work that you and others have done in making today happen, for securing so many, I guess, wonderful speakers and participants. As you mentioned, and fitting that on a day that explores technology, you are hosting what could be considered, as I mentioned, your first baby steps into a hybrid event. And I look forward to next year, and next year, not even for the Jornada, but next year's roundtables where we can meet in person here at the University of Florianopolis. As I mentioned also on my way in, the Florianopolis has definitely made me feel at home. The rain has been coming down, the clouds are grey, but the energy is real and the positivity is palpable. So for me, I guess it really is more than ever, and we say this a lot when we're opening events, that it's a real pleasure to be here. But it really is honestly a real pleasure to be here at Ufsc to open this 5th Jornada of NEI. A little over a year ago, if I can just go back in time for a bit, I spoke with Beatrice for the first time. I had heard of Beatrice from colleagues in Ireland, but I'd never met Beatrice, had never engaged. But in the engagement that followed, she said 2 points that really stuck with me and really struck me. The first, we have had to reinvent and redesign events. And the second, we hope to be able to greet you in Florianopolis in person next year. I'll come to the second point first, if that makes sense. In August 2020, I arrived here in Sao Paulo, as Ireland's Consul General for the first time during the height of COVID with my wife Fobia and Melancholic, and my little girl Maya. 3 weeks after, I met Beatrice virtually via email. 6 weeks after I arrived, I took part in my first NEI roundtable, an incredible exchange on how the story travels, the contemporary Irish short story. And if I can say how the story travels, how true that is proven, I've only been in Brazil a year, in essence, an Irish short story of sorts. Over the last couple of weeks, the consulate has been fortunate to have our former president, Mary Robinson, take part in a number of events here in Brazil, and with some valuable partners in Brazil. She spoke so effortlessly about climate and climate justice, but more importantly for me, and relevant for today, she too spoke about the story, its importance, and how important it is as it travels around the world. Indeed, Beatrice, Alinne, Ufsc, and NEI, our story has traveled quite a lot, if truth be told, in such a short time. I have reflected on this a lot since arriving in Florianopolis this week, almost 14 months since arriving in Brazil. My first time in the state of Santa Catarina. It has been a year of many challenges, but many firsts, and I was so grateful, and I am so grateful and very much aware that many of my firsts and most memorable experiences thus far here in Brazil are with Ufsc, NEI, Beatrice, Alinne, and as I mentioned, the team around them. So thank you again, Beatrice, Alinne, and Fabio, for greeting me here in person for my first in-person event. And I say in person because there are people in the room outside of Sao Paulo since I arrived in this absolutely wonderful country. But if I can come back to Beatrice's comment, her first comment to me in our first exchange, we have had to reinvent and redesign events. I can safely say, and I'm sure I speak for everybody listening in this morning from Brazil and beyond, NEI has certainly achieved this. You have continued to think outside the box, you continue to break down boundaries, and you have most certainly reinvented and redesigned how you promote Irish studies to those here in Brazil, as well as those from further afield. You have kept it interesting, you have kept it relevant, and most importantly, you have made Irish studies accessible to so many. Most recently, we were treated to an incredible roundtable on Tom Murphy, one of Ireland's greatest contemporary playwrights. Before that, Shakespeare, translation and performance, creative writing, contemporary Irish film studies, Irish literature and eco-criticism, and let us not forget contemporary Beckett. It has been a privilege to have been a part of these roundtables that certainly bore the reinvention and redesign that Beatrice so promised. With your roundtables, NEI has been able to create a virtual Irish living room where the discussion has been more than vibrant. The virtual reality ensured the participation of many who may not have been available otherwise. In turn, this ensured rich, dynamic, captivating exchanges with real and illuminating insights and perspectives from an array of incredible speakers, including Vincent O'Toole, John Brannigan, Lucy Collins, Melina Savi, Alan Gilsman, Melatu Okori, Eoin de Bardoon, Vincent Woods, Trish McTighe, James Little, Nicholas Green, Jane Brennan, Jose Roberto O'Shea, Janaina, Melina, Rosa, and so many more. Indeed, before the pandemic so abruptly closed the doors to visitors here and across the globe, there was quite a few illustrious visitors to these shores from Ireland. In addition to some of the names I just mentioned, Irish playwrights and writers such as Marina Carr, Colin Murphy, and Sinead Gleeson, along with Professor Margaret Kelleher, Professor Dr. Ian Walsh, and Professor Dr. Miriam Houghton, have all been here and visited Florianopolis on invitation from NEI. A stellar lineup. In 2012, President of Ireland, Michael D. Higgins, described Irish studies in Brazil as something different, something unique, something colourful, and even exotic. I feel that over the last 5 years or so, we have seen this and more as Irish studies in Ufsc and Brazil as a whole, notwithstanding the challenging year that we have all had to endure, has gone from strength to strength, with President Higgins' comments certainly resonating. Ufsc and NEI are driving forces behind this, with their outstanding promotion of Irish arts, literature, theatre and culture here in Brazil, Latin America, and also beyond. It really is, as I said already, to be here in person on behalf not just of the Irish Consulate, but of the Irish Embassy in Brazil, to acknowledge this extraordinary and innovative contribution to the promotion of Irish studies. Together with your team in Florianopolis, you are all instrumental promoters and educators of Irish studies here in Brazil. And today's event is yet just another demonstration of this. For this, the Consulate, I, the Embassy, and Sean Hoy, our ambassador in Brasilia, are most grateful. We value highly our close friendship and look forward to the continued success of our strong partnership in the weeks, months, and years ahead. I spoke recently at an event about the importance of conversations, discussions, whether virtual or in person. The work of Ufsc and NEI has ensured that these invaluable conversations and discussions have continued with virtual gatherings that look at, analyse, and reflect on Irish studies and continue to connect and unite us. It is a wonderful and important link to Ireland for those who've left, those who love, and those who have yet to visit our shores. Indeed, today's programme brings us closer again as we explore the intersections of Irish literature, theatre, and technology. Technology has made it easier for more of us to attend, engage, discuss, and learn from so many around the world, from anywhere in the world. The impact of COVID has only heightened this. With this in mind, we are about to embark on another virtual, all-inclusive journey, a journey that will consider and explore Irish theatre and technology, including radio drama, labouring and dancing. From there, we will explore theatre and film in Northern Ireland, before returning to modern Irish literature and contemporary Irish theatre. In the midst of this, we will hear from Claire Lynch from Brunel University in London on consoling technologies in contemporary Irish fiction, Barry Houlihan from NUI Galway on sound and vision, the technology of memory in contemporary Irish drama, and of course, some valuable insights and perspectives from Irish playwright and director Stacey Craig. This all makes for an outstanding day of conversation, discussion and debate, and for one, I'm very more than excited about. Without a doubt, today's Jornada demonstrates once again the unwavering commitment, passion and promotion of Irish studies here at Ufsc and NEI, a fact demonstrated further by the college's, university's involvement in next year's centenary celebrations of the publication of James Joyce's Ulysses. Ulysses at 100 pelo óleos brasileiros brings together 18 Brazilian universities, including Ufsc, and cultural institutions to commission a set of 18 murals, each representing one of the 18 chapters of Ulysses. I, for one, look forward to visiting Ufsc again for the unveiling of their mural. I won't go into which chapter Ufsc will be taking, as I understand that will be a surprise for future weeks and months to come. But I can assure you that the chapter that they are looking to do will absolutely bring massive, I guess, connection and understanding and relevance to Ulysses and the college here and the university here in Florianopolis. In addition to this collaboration on Ulysses, Beatrice herself has agreed to act as a curator for another important project that brings Ireland and Brazil closer together. In 2022, Brazil will celebrate the bicentenary of its independence, while Ireland celebrates 100 years of our independence. It is for this reason that the Consulate and the Embassy of Ireland in Brazil will collaborate with the National Library in Rio to develop an exhibition telling the story of Ireland in Brazil. This will launch at the National Library next year before touring across several states. As part of this exhibition, we want to highlight Brazil's long and rich relationship with Ireland's literary greats, Irish theatre, and the countless translations of many of Ireland's epic masterpieces, including Swift's Gulliver Travels and, of course, Joyce's Ulysses. We want to illuminate for visitors to the fact that many of the literary works by Ireland's greatest writers have found a home at the National Library in Rio. Ufsc and NEI have been illuminating so many themselves through their dedication and passion of those promoting Irish studies. Indeed, many here in Brazil may never have had the opportunity to experience and enjoy the best of Irish literature, best of Irish theatre, best of Irish poetry. The art of translation is one thing, but the challenge and difficulty in translating literature and poetry, for me, are altogether a different art. Literary translation is a hugely important task. It makes it possible for more of us to enjoy the experience, the words, and the writer in a real way. It helps to shape a reader's understanding of their world, their culture, their history, philosophy, politics, and so much more. Many of those participating in today's event have dedicated themselves to this art. You have brought Irish literature to so many here in Brazil through a new lens, and for this, I thank you. In normal times, events such as today offered us a wonderful and a unique opportunity for people-to-people contact, to meet up, create new and renew existing friendships. While we are nearly there, unfortunately, we cannot all be in person this year, but we are certainly together in our love and passion for Irish studies. With this in mind, I would like to finish, if I can, with the words of Emily Pine, Associate Professor of Modern Drama at University College Dublin, my alma mater, who has published widely in the field of Irish studies and is editor of the Irish University Review, the leading global journey of Irish literary studies. On March 18, 2020, the day after Ireland closed its doors due to COVID, Emily Pine remarked as the Irish University celebrated 50 years. We celebrate the value of emotional and intellectual investment in the world around us, from people to poetry, from landscape to language, from society to story. While it may not be a 50th anniversary yet, 2021 is a significant year as it marks your 5th anniversary, the 5th anniversary since NEA has been founded. A lot has been achieved in this short but very fruitful time, evident from the vast collection of publications that includes books, book chapters, journals, volumes, articles, and translations, while quite a number of NEI members have and currently represent NEI and Ufsc with distinction overseas. Yourself, Maria Rita, completed your postdoctoral studies at the University of Toronto, while Beatrice and Alinne were awarded the Moore Institute Visiting Fellowship at NUI Galway, with Beatrice currently associated with the Humanities Institute of UCD as a visiting fellow. In Ireland, Aloysia Dalbello, a Dublin James Joyce Summer School Scholarship awardee, who is currently at Trinity College for a sandwich doctorate with Cappy's Print, and Caitlin Mada Rosa, who is also at Trinity College with the prestige Irish Research Council Fellowship for postdoctoral, are just a few of those. Many NEI members participate annually in international congresses such as ISIL, MLA, SILAS, and the Canadian Association of Irish Studies. With the international community opening up again after what has been the most challenging of times, I am confident that many more NEI members will follow in their footsteps. So, as we do begin to open our doors again and look to the future, let us celebrate this milestone for NEI at Ufsc in the way that Emily Pine describes. And if I may repeat, let us celebrate the value of emotional and intellectual investment in the world around us, from people to poetry, from landscape to language, from society to story. I wish you all the very best for the day ahead, and a day that I'm really much looking forward to. It's great to be here in Florianopolis, and I'm looking forward already to my next trip. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Eoin, and I apologize again. We'll move on to Fábio, who is the director of Centro de Cultura e Expressão at Ufsc, and it's my pleasure to introduce you, Fábio. Is the technology working okay now? Okay. Yeah, fantastic.
Perfect. Thank you, Professor Maria Rita. Good morning, folks. It's really a great pleasure to open this symposium along with Mr. Bennis, Professor Alinne, Professor Maria Rita. I first met Professor Beatriz and some members of the Núcleo of Irish Studies in 2015, when I was the director of the Federal University of Santa Catarina Press. I was introduced to Professor Beatriz by our dear colleague, José Roberto Rocher, and she presented me on that occasion a wonderful project. The proposal of the publication of a series of Irish movies. And I immediately said, yes, of course. Yes, please. Let's publish right now. Sadly, for me, at least, some months after that, I had to leave my position, but I had the opportunity to publish the first book of the series, the magnificent documentary by Alan Gilson, The Road to God Knows Where. In fact, it was my very last act as the director of the Federal University of Santa Catarina Press. Those were the days I really loved to be the director. I have wonderful memories of that time, but that was the most beautiful one. I love that book. I love Gilson's movie, how he approaches the Irish crisis in the 80s, particularly how young people deals with that. We are now in Brazil, as you may know, on the road to God knows where, and we have much to learn from Gilson's testimonies, the testimonies he gathered. And since that publication, my very last act as the director of the Federal University of Santa Catarina Press, as I said, I fell in love with the Nucleum. I fell in love with Irish studies, and I'm really happy to be here once again to open our virtual doors to you. I wish you have a great event. I'm sure it will gonna happen. Welcome. Thank you so much for the opportunity to share this experience. And the Center of Communication and Expression is eager to establish other projects and go on with this partnership. Thank you so much. Thank you. And well, have a nice event.
Thank you so much, Fabio. We'll move on now to Alinne. Alinne has, okay, all good. Good to go.
I'm here. Hello. Thank you very much for your kind and generous words, Fabio. Good morning to you all, and thank you for being here today. Alinne Fernandes, the current director of Núcleo De Estudos Irlandeses, the Irish Studies Research Cluster at Universidade Federal de Santa Catarina, whose pet name is NEI, as Maria Rita has already put. I also want to thank Fabio Lopes, the current director of Centro de Comunicação e Expressão, and Eoin Bennis, Ireland's consul in Brazil, for being with us in person today. The Irish Consul has been of great support to our event and has been a very good partner of NEI over the years. This is the 5th edition of our Jornadas, an event that has been held annually since the foundation of the research cluster in 2016. Because of the pandemic in 2020, we replaced the Jornada with NEI's digital roundtables, but decided to go forward with it in 2021. This year's theme is Intersections of Irish Literature, Theatre and Technology, and is much inspired by our socially mediated existence throughout 2020 and 2021. During the past 2 years, NEI's meetings revolved around the discussion of plays, essays, and poems that dealt with the remarkable presence and interference of the various types of technologies in our daily lives. We read Stacey Gregg's Override, Leon Chiflin's The Radio, Derek Mahan's I Chose the Typewriter Over the Internet, Brian Friel's Dancing at Lughnasa, Conor McPherson's The Weir, Enda Walsh's The Walworth Farce, and Samuel Beckett's Craft's Last Tape, as well as critical essays by Claire Lynch, Paige Reynolds, and Fintan O'Toole. Our goal was to think about the roles the various devices that surround us play in our lives. What do they bring up to us? Do they bring us together or pull us apart? To quote from Derek Mahon, "Rewired for electronic information, blinded by science, we're in danger of losing touch with primary experience. The unmediated sea wrack on the strand is even stranger to us than it was to Joyce. Whatever the dire economic and social consequences of the digital revolution, and there are many, it's the commodification of thought that's most alarming. That and the robotic invigilation, but there's nothing ineluctable about it." This year's Jornada then reflects on this and much more, with lectures by Claire Lynch and Barry Houlihan, an interview with Stacey Gregg, and a panel on Irish theatre and technology, as well as 3 more panels on the work in progress of our students. Whether or not you consider yourself a new Luddite, as Derek Mahon, whose distrust of the internet made him write only on the typewriter, you're still surrounded by machines. Thank you, and welcome to our 5th Jornada.
Thank you so much for this, Alinne. We now officially move on to the business of the day, to the journey. And I'm just remembering something that we had in the interview I conducted with Roy Foster later last year, at the end of last year, when he mentioned that Brian Friel said he didn't check emails, but he actually did. So I'd like to know more about Derek Mahon and his neo-ludism. But it's my absolute pleasure, and it's an honor to introduce today for you the amazing Claire Lynch, who is professor in English and Irish literature at Brunel University. Claire has published widely with articles and chapters on technology and Irish writing, as well as 2 Irish studies monographs. Our students will know Claire as the author of Cyber Ireland, Text, Image, Culture, from which, like Alinne said, we've read in our monthly meetings throughout the year. But the other monograph, and the reason I personally have been following her work for many years now, is this one, Irish Autobiography, Stories of the Self in the Narrative of the Nation, from 2009. So if you thought this was plenty reason for us to have Claire as our keynote speaker here today, well, it's not. There's more. She's also a writer of creative nonfiction and has published in the Washington Post, given a talk on BBC Radio 4, and her award-winning first essay was later developed into her debut volume, Small, on Motherhoods. Okay. Published earlier this year with Brazen. I only have the Kindle version, Claire, because I couldn't wait for the time it took to have it shipped to Brazil when it first came out. So I just went on and bought the Kindle, but I do hope to get a physical copy soon. I am so excited to hear you talk today, to talk to us today, this morning, Claire. So without further ado, we have Claire Lynch.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me, for making me blush a little bit with the introduction. It's a real, I know we're all saying this, but genuinely a real honor and pleasure to be part of the event, to be gathering together as we are today. Thank you to all of those who have done the work of organizing and bringing us here together. Thank you to anyone who is managing a challenging time zone. I was at a conference in Adelaide a couple of weeks ago, and I know the feeling of being sort of delirious with sleeplessness and pretending to be your academic self on a screen. So if you're here in the middle of the night or early in the morning, thank you for finding us. I'm going to just share my screen now, I hope, with you, so that there are some images to go along in the background while I'm talking, and anything that I am bringing up, I hope you'll be able to see there. I'm hoping that's clear to everyone.
It's all good.
Great. Okay. So I'll get started. My lecture for us to share and discuss today has a bit of a strange title, and I hope that will become clear as I go on. It's called A Typing and the dots are important here, a typing ... not typing, long pause, a typing again, with the subtitle Consoling Technologies in Contemporary Irish Fiction. I'm going to start by thinking about a collection of Irish poetry. On the 24th of August 2019, the poet Stephen Sexton described the writing of this, his first collection, If All the World and Love Were Young, in the Irish Times. He wrote, as a kind of joke, I figured I'd write a poem for every level of Super Mario World, harnessing the urge towards completeness so deeply felt by many players of video games. In the article, Sexton describes the memory of childhood afternoons lost to the game, Sexton and his brother, side by side, playing as the brothers Mario and Luigi. As he worked on the poems, Sexton recalled a photograph his mother had taken of him playing the game as a child. He writes, I based the book on this image, me as Mario, seeing myself. The photograph returns in an early poem in the collection, Yoshi's Island 1, as follows. I'll just read a few lines from the poem. I remember myself being remembered, a little lotus, a cross-legged meditant, for whom the questions floating in the air are for a future self to voice, decades from now, who will return again and again to this room and these moments of watershed. For the boy in the photograph and in the poem, Super Mario World is a site of consolation and comfort. Sexton recalls a boyhood spent playing on his childminder's Nintendo as his parents worked, and in the long summer holidays and the strange afternoons of childhood, the hours between finishing school and the day closing into sleep. The arrival of his own gaming console is also a memory of his mother as a provider of comfort. He describes in the Irish Times article her opening the boot of the car to reveal the machine, a memory he describes as sheer cardiac joy. The mother who is shown to understand his desire and meet it. Finally, in the poems which draw on these memories, Sexton returns us not just to the physical world of Counting Down in the mid-1990s, but to the landscapes and challenges of Super Mario World, the donut plains, Vanilla Fortress, Star World of the game. Sexton's poems are an elegy for two lost worlds, and the recalling of them leads the poet to losses as well as gains. He writes, all elegies involve a kind of economy. One has lost the subject of the poem, but one has gained the elegy. One knows the elegy won't do, but one tries so hard to make it large, as big as a world or worlds even, and one persists knowing it won't do, in filling those worlds with colours and creatures and places and things and circumstances, light and sadness and joy. In writing the poems, Sexton forfeits his access to Super Mario World. The game and the places within it are no longer sites of innocent escapism, but have become instead places in which to meditate on grief, landscapes through which he recalls his dead mother. At the same time, the game is elevated by the poems, since the poems about the game now provide the comfort once offered by the game itself. This lecture will draw on several examples of contemporary Irish writing, and I want to use this time to explore the significance of everyday technological objects, games consoles, phones, laptops, and all of the mundane uses that we have for them: play, communication, seeking information. I'll be arguing in the lecture, much as Sexton has done in his poetry, inspired by Super Mario World, that these objects and their uses are, in fact, sites of intense human emotion and experience. So for a little sense of overview about what I plan to talk about here, some context, if we think, for example, of quote, Connell's face illuminated by the lit display of a phone in Sally Rooney's Normal People, what we really see there is a moment of intimacy between the characters. When the character Sinead Hines is shown Googling in bed in Elaine Feeney's As You Were, we learn much about the character's desire for privacy, her realism, her sense of humour. As the boy in Emo McBride's A Girl is a Half-Formed Thing hammers the controls of a computer game, we see a character finding refuge, expression, and intimacy in the company of endlessly understanding machines. These are the machines that support their users, distract them, comfort them. The console consoles. As T.L. Taylor argues, despite the promise of a world transformed by, quote, magical technologies, most people's relationships with technological objects are always moving closer to the mundane. Over the past 2 decades, such mundane technologies have characterized our use of computers as far more practical than magical. While much is made of the cultural and psychological impact of social media, or the futuristic applications of augmented reality, a smartphone is as likely to be used to check the weather forecast, buy the groceries, or find directions on a map. For many, a laptop is simply the default portal to entertainment, education, or work. Whether one chooses to view this as a depressing dystopia or an exhilarating progress, it's impossible to deny technology's increasing embeddedness in everyday life. I suppose our event right now is evidence of just that. What is clear is that the ubiquity of handheld or portable computers has brought with it an increased physical connection with mundane technologies, a sensual as well as an intellectual bond. We carry our machines with us now. Their beeps and vibrations punctuating real conversation, their capacity for knowledge always on hand to supplement our own. It is the device, the gadget at the end of our fingertips, which, as Simeone puts it, we can truly think of as, quote, a technology of the imagination. The fictional characters I'm going to discuss in this lecture use their machines in all the mundane ways we might expect. We're going to see characters composing emails, researching medical symptoms, playing games, checking social media. My contention here is that computers and other gadgets are not just incidental props which situate the character in a particular time and place. On the contrary, they're an essential part of the narrative. The machines in these novels are tools which advance the plot, offer insight into a character's behavior, and in some cases express a specific framework through which the novel might be most clearly viewed. Elaine Feeney's protagonist, Sinead Hines, is rarely shown without a smartphone or a laptop in the novel As You Were. We see the character Googling her diagnosis, researching how to write her will, and sending emojis to her children from her hospital bed. At the centre of the novel is hospital patient Sinead's decision to hide her terminal status from her husband, Alex. Instead of talking about her illness with her loved ones or doctors, Sinead turns to her machine, drawn to the comforting numbness it provides, going, quote, mad with Google. The particular refuge Sinead takes in Google is apparent in the text as both serious and frivolous queries are placed side by side, capturing the leaps in logic and imagination that the search engine creates. As she contemplates, I wouldn't have to Google tips on losing weight for the foreseeable future, but I continue to chat with Google under the duvet for solace. How to live the pain-free life, doing the proper online will, how to control your dying, how to stand comfortably in heels, property prices in Bulgaria, how to get the thigh gap. Sinead's growing dependence on Google for answers and distractions creates an increasing sense of alienation from her husband. The intimacy she establishes with Google is preferable because it is infinitely more controllable. If Google provides Sinead with answers she doesn't want to see, she is free to skip them, move on, ignore. the scale of online information provided in response to any search query is such that a user is always required to hold two contradictory thoughts in mind at once. This is true, this is nonsense. Throughout the novel, Sinead remains self-aware about her reliance on her machines, reveling in the appeal of their predictability, in direct contrast to her unpredictable body. Computers and phones offer illusions of comfort for Sinead when she's in hospital, but they are also the practical means by which her connection to Alex is preserved. The narrator acknowledges that talking to Alex via text was much nicer than dealing with his breathing and humming and hawing and real life him. He was more eloquent or direct in texts, and they allowed little room for me to get edgy. Emojis offered due emotion quickly and without complication or effort. I was ever so grateful for them. Her husband, Alex, as mediated through the screen of her phone, is more palatable. His on-screen persona fails to provoke the tense and short-tempered exchanges that characterize their in-person discussions. The couple's message exchanges benefit from additional time not afforded in spoken conversation. From her hospital bed, Sinead has time to read and reread, to compose and edit her response. Feeney's book captures these interactions on the page, ruminating on the way messages pass back and forth, including the device as an interlocutor in its own right. Here, Feeney plays with the conventions of online communication by including not only the content of the messages characters send one another, but also the paratext that contributes so much to the meaning and gives the title to this lecture: a typing ... not typing, long pause, a typing again. These words, not a message from another person, but from the phone itself, show the machine as an ally, an intermediary voice of comfort, assuring the user that someone is listening. So much is implied in the gap between messages, the three flashing dots, which conjure up an imagined reply or threaten to withdraw it. During these message exchanges, Sinead imagines, quote, Alex sat at home with a large bag of cheese puffs, doors and windows all open, radio blaring. Her image of him spans multiple time frames, simultaneously a memory of her life before her illness, a vision of him now, and a potential imagined future in which he exists without her. Still, as the novel progresses, the mundane technologies featured are acknowledged not just as a communication aid or a distraction, but as a direct and disruptive threat to their relationship. When Alex finally witnesses the extent of Sinead's illness, her decision to not tell him about her prognosis is read as a betrayal. It is not, after all, that she keeps her illness to herself. She has told the machine over and over. As Alex accuses, quote, I bet you told Google you were dying, he paused, before me. Sinead's deep reliance on her machine to console her is not unique in As You Were, but rather fits within the technological ecosystem of the hospital ward. We see other patients like Margaret Rose with her, quote, large charcoal Dell laptop on her meal table. Shane with his laptop on constant charge, the way he looked at it all day with one eye open, drooling. We see all the patients in the novel bonded to their machines. Just as their bodies are connected to machines which monitor heart rates or urine outputs, so they stay connected to some other version of themselves via the movies, photos, and music on their computers, a time and a place before their bodies revealed their fallibility. This sense of the computer offering an alternative reality to the sick body is also explored in Emma McBride's 2013 novel, A Girl is a Half-Formed Thing. In this novel, as many people will remember, the unnamed boy is shown giddy with pleasure as his on-screen double punches and kicks his way to victory in his favourite video games. The actions in the game punctuate McBride's prose with strikes on the keyboard and jerks of the joystick. As the novel progresses, the boy's enjoyment becomes an obsession. The more he plays, the better he gets. As the boy becomes increasingly lost to the endless hours of fun provided by the computer, his mother comes to view the machine as dangerously unproductive. His play, as she sees it, is a morally questionable use of time, since the computer ought to be used for, quote, further education, the futuristic work done by enigmatic analysts in rows in shirts. Now, typically, analyses of video games make a distinction between the human player operating the computer and the on-screen character who represents him or her within the game, the avatar. The avatar and the player have a complex relationship which varies according to several factors, including the type of game played, the environment, and the context in which the game is played, as well as, of course, the experience and the skill of the person playing. Still, I think it would be fanciful to suggest that the person playing ceases to exist in the physical world during gameplay. In this novel, the kicking, punching avatar doesn't replace the boy, he joins him. By moving the controls or tapping the screen, the player physically engages with, quote, the bits of plastic and metal, silicon and glass. As Atkins in his book, The Computer Game as a Fictional Form, writes, this human engagement with computers is plainly physical, straining backs and eyes as the game takes its toll on the body, even as it promises a disembodied and virtual experience. The physical body of the player is, paradoxically, both active and sedentary. He sits, paralyzed by the screen, as his hands press, twist, and click to power the endlessly dynamic avatar. In A Girl is a Half-Formed Thing, the boy establishes a symbolic relationship with his avatar because the body on the screen is capable of things his real body is not. Still, the virtual body is only capable of movement at all if the boy's actual hands and eyes direct him to do so. In his review of A Girl is a Half-Formed Thing, James Wood describes McBride's, quote, blazingly daring novel as set in an island shorn of dates and obvious historical specificity, only conceding that the presence of a Walkman hints at the 1980s. But what about the computer? Are computers and games consoles really so ubiquitous as to become invisible to readers? Contrary to Wood's sense that this is a timeless narrative, in my reading, the arrival of the first computer in this Irish home could be said to date McBride's novel precisely. The arrival of the new computer fractures the already strained family structure, annexing the son/brother to his bedroom and away from the communal domestic spaces. When the mother in the novel complains of her evenings, quote, sitting down here on my own while her children are upstairs playing video games, she highlights the way computers change how and where we spend our time. As Bernadette Flynn has described, the veneration of a games console in the home restructures the domestic space, as well as producing a discernible change in the functionality and symbolism of technology within the home. As Flynn goes on to explain, the etymological root of hearth, the Latin for focus, is especially apt in describing the technologies which have traditionally trained the domestic gaze before being superseded. So if we move from the original fireplace to the radio, then the television, and latterly the games console, Flynn's work describes a process of domestication of video games, from the public spectacle of the arcade into the heart of the home, making the point that although the console is in the home, it is not of it. From the earliest video game consoles onwards, designers have been keen to emphasize the idea of the console as, quote, a futuristic dream machine in opposition to the place of its location. In A Girl is a Half-Formed Thing, the hearth, the centre of the family home, is symbolically displaced. The mother is left alone, the family splintered, not gathered. For the boy, a clear distinction emerges: the before computer era and after. While his mother continues to insist that playing games on a computer is a waste of God's good fruits, its impact can't be undone. As with Sinead's self-destructive reliance on Google for solace, so the boy in A Girl is a Half-Formed Thing reaches a tipping point in his absorption of the world of the game. Attempting to move the virtual violence from the screen to his own body, he recounts, quote, "I think I'd like to kick like that. I practice it when there's no one in. I high-yard the clothesline and it broke." While his emulation of video game violence may seem childish, it is in many ways an appropriate response to the immersive experience. To play successfully, to win, the player must collaborate with the computer, learning to think and behave in the way the computer demands. The pleasure of play, one might argue, depends upon the player melding with the computer, sharing its thought process. As the adult brother and sister share video games in McBride's novel, they return to the childhood play and the sibling alliance which has protected them from their mother's cruelty. Their regeneration as playmates also marks a further shift in the novel's complex time frame. So as the girl gets older and more independent from the controlling family unit, her brother's brain tumor conspires to make him effectively younger, a little boy again, and then eventually a baby in nappies needing to be spoon-fed. The video games they play together are a crucial component of this narrative, creating an imagined other, the man he is never to become, a man who might use computers for work, in contrast to the boy who only uses them for play and fantasy. I'll just read this short quotation. "Mad lust of it you get for computer games go blip across a screen. That's your 18th birthday gift, improve your mind with. The new love, take up all your time, eating sweets and Jupiter landing. Come on and have a go. No, I don't want to. It's killing your brain cells. So, the video games aren't killing his brain cells, but they are dying all the same. Jupiter Landing, one of the early video games available on the Commodore 64 computer, the game that's played by the characters in McBride's novel, challenges players to probe the planet's surface, carefully navigating the folds and valleys of the dark landscape, not unlike the surgeons who concede in their efforts to root out the invading tumors in the boy's brain. The destruction of his brain, caused both by the tumor and the various operations which failed to remove it, result in a hardware fault. The brain is simply unable to process as it once had. In 2017, Sally Rooney's debut novel, Conversations with Friends, emerged to critical and popular acclaim. Rooney's status as the defining voice in post-crash Irish fiction was established in part by her characteristic use of email and messenger exchanges as central to the narrative. As she explained in an interview with the Irish Times, Rooney says that the voice that I have when I'm writing emails feels like my voice. That's me writing, trying to communicate something to someone who I trust, as I would like to trust a reader. I mean, that's my voice, isn't it? The book itself is almost like one of those emails, like a controlled outpouring. Rooney's naturalistic use of email as both a stylistic trope and plot device was expanded further in her second novel, Normal People, in which protagonist Marianne is described as having, quote, a face like a piece of technology, and her two eyes are cursors blinking. Normal People, as I'm sure many of us here are well aware, It's a coming-of-age novel exploring the unique physical and intellectual connection between Conall and Marianne over the course of a few years in their sort of late teens into early adulthood. As with the other novels discussed here, the presence of technology is entirely unremarkable. Yet the way in which Rooney uses the technology to simultaneously capture internal experience and external action is structurally and stylistically innovative. So when Marianne, for example, sends a text to Conall after one of her brother Alan's bullying episodes, the shake in her hand provides evidence of her distress. We see her, quote, repeatedly hitting the wrong key, deleting and retyping, even if the actual message she sends, on my way, fails to convey to her lover that anything is wrong. These kinds of exchanges play a crucial role in Normal People, conveying the ever-shifting dynamics between the two central characters. In the early part of the novel, Rooney draws out the duality of the relationship, simultaneously public and private. The characters' phones act as a juncture in this enterprise, a crossover point where the truth is written out on screens. So when Marianne is roped into selling raffle tickets for the Debs fundraising committee, as she thinks presumably some kind of a joke, Marianne texts Conall witty, flirty messages, all the while maintaining the public fiction that they are ambivalent towards each other. Marianne is completely aware in this moment of how easy it would be to reveal the truth on her phone, as well as, quote, how destabilizing it would be, how destructive. When the protagonist's paths threaten to diverge at the end of school, Conall changes his plans and applies to study at Trinity College, just like Marianne. We see Conall in the act of making this decision. Rooney describes it like this. The laptop screen has gone black now, and he taps the trackpad to light it up again. The college application's web pages stare back at him. Conall's interaction with the college application web page is presented by Rooney as an identity crisis, an opportunity to resolve the consuming sense that, quote, he is in fact two separate people. Here, Rooney reimagines the existential crisis of a young man by distilling it down not into an abstract question, but into the simple practicality of a drop-down box on a website. Here are the multiple lives Conall might lead, each accessible via the click of a mouse. As the novel progresses, readers witness Marianne and Conall moving in and out of each other's orbit. Their initial breakup is characterized by a parallel breakdown in communication, calls unanswered, messages left without a reply. Later, as the physical distance between them grows, an email correspondence evolves to bridge the gap. When Conall is traveling in Europe, now in a new relationship, he takes up what's described in the novel as 3 rituals of communication in each city he visits. He calls Helen, that's his girlfriend, on Skype. He sends his mother a free text message from his phone network's website, and he writes Marianne an email. Through these lengthy emails, the lengthy emails they exchange, Marianne and Conall arguably develop the most successful manifestation of their relationship. When refracted through their machines, they are able to articulate their thoughts with precision. Finally, it seems, these two sensitive and self-conscious characters are able to convey themselves to one another in precisely the way they want to be seen, circumventing the damaging misunderstandings that they suffer from in real life. When Marianne leaves for Sweden in her third year of university, Conall's fears of missing her are eclipsed by how much he is, quote, looking forward to how long and intense their email correspondence will be while she's away. At this stage in the novel, the email exchange between the characters is so firmly established as the superior track of their relationship that we see Conall at one point viewing the Italian scenery as an inspiration for an email to Marianne, and then pausing with the realization that he can't email her because she's just downstairs. Yet for all the emails seem to resolve their relationship challenges, it is also an email which ultimately causes the final rift between Marianne and Conall. We leave the characters drawing apart again in response to the news arriving in Conall's inbox. As she listens, Marianne continues to dress. Her reaction is measured, logical. Conall sits up in bed with her laptop in his hands. The email he receives opens up yet another imagined future, a plan which signals another ending in their relationship. These final moments of intimacy then are in fact between Conall and the machine. The computer already knows. We see this scene at the end. He looks dumbly at the laptop and then back at her. His eyes look red and sleepy. She's doing the shirt buttons. He's sitting with his knees propped up under the duvet, the laptop glowing into his face. Now, I had promised in the abstract to talk a little bit about Enright's Forgotten Waltz here, but I'm taking a little risk to talk about something brand new, particularly because it's a novel that, had we been able to meet originally in person in 2020, we would not have been able to get to Sally Rooney's very new latest novel. So I'm going to move towards the end of my lecture now by talking about Beautiful World, Where Are You?, which was published in September of this year. Beautiful World, Where Are You? Is a novel in which screens and devices are essential to the exchange of narrative information. Yet they're also so prevalent as to become prosthetic extensions of the characters themselves. On the opening page of the novel, we meet novelist Alice Kelleher as she, quote, glanced at the screen of her phone on which was displaying a messaging interface, and then she looked back at the door. Soon after, we see her sitting on a bed in Italy, in the action of opening a map on her phone, moving her fingers with practiced ease around the screen. Characters in Beautiful World are endlessly shown, taking their phones from their pockets, checking their small screens. Their phones in the novel are employed as torches and cameras. We see characters, quote, scrolling through a text document, dropping addresses into Google Maps, maps which are described by Rooney as, quote, a network of white streets on a background of grey beside a blue area representing the sea. These are characters, much like Sexton's player Avatar in the poems I was talking about in the opening of the lecture, who live in their devices and the real world simultaneously. Yet it's email again that I'll argue is the truly significant consoling technology in this novel. So often in Rooney's fiction, the novel is structured around a core relationship, which is marked by a contrast between the real world and its tensions and instabilities, and then an online relationship shown to be linguistically fluent and intellectually razor sharp. The quotation on the screen is taken from one of these email exchanges. I'll read it to you. You should know that our correspondence is my way of holding on to life, taking notes on it, and thereby preserving something of my otherwise almost worthless or even entirely worthless existence on this rapidly degenerating planet. This type of witty exchange, the self-conscious arch tone, also provide the friends with a space for deep philosophical reflection. Both Eileen and Alice are as much using the emails to develop their own positions. They're a kind of textual posturing, as they are genuinely engaging in an exchange of information. The emails are an essential aspect of Rooney's latest novel because they seem to operate on a different plane from the in-person interactions. In the exchanges mediated by machines, Alice and Eileen generate something hyper-real, engaging in a form of communication which would seem contrived or even impossible face-to-face. As Alice writes, quote, when we see each other after all these emails, I'm going to get very shy and hide my head under my wing like a little bird. One way to describe this, of course, is to claim these email exchanges for the literary space. It is in these sections of the novel where Rooney's language and form expresses most clearly a permission to express the philosophical and poetic. Yet it's equally true to say that Rooney insists on the use of email between her protagonists, precisely because it ensures the omnipresence of machines. So more simply put, the sending and receiving of email is not just an exchange between people, but a physical interaction between bodies and machines. I think we can learn a lot from looking closely at the way Rooney describes these interactions. Here's another example. This is when we're seeing Alinne at work. Using the soft, greasy roller on her computer mouse, she skimmed over the document, eyes flicking back and forth across the narrow columns of text, and occasionally she stopped, clicked, and inserted or deleted characters. In this description, which extends in the novel for a lengthy paragraph, the reader is invited to watch a woman, who we will later come to know as Alinne. Rooney not only shows us a woman at her desk, but the precise actions of her cursor on the screen of her computer. We see all the pedestrian actions of her inserting 2 full stops up until the point she reaches a conclusion, and Rooney shows her saving her work, closing the file. This then is the work of the beautiful world that the novel takes place in. The moving of characters on a screen in a Word document find their parallel in Felix's warehouse work, in which packages are picked up from one location in the building and put down in another. The individual tasks, piecemeal and even dehumanizing, and the work of the end product barely visible to the worker as they make their fractional contribution. In this new novel, as with the others, Rooney demonstrates a sense of control as well as consolation, which is wrought by technology. Here in Beautiful World, the rift between the friends can, I think, be read as a direct echo of Connell and Marianne's initial breakup in Normal People. We see it in the novel in this way. Alice won a lucrative literary award, moved to New York, and started sending Alinne emails at strange hours of the day and night. Then she stopped emailing at all, deleted her social media profiles, ignored Eileen's messages. This breakdown in communication is an echo of a wider breakdown, as Alice is admitted to a Dublin psychiatric hospital. Later, Alice is shown to exist online in a way that separates her from others. Her fame as a novelist, creating a duality not experienced by normal people. When Felix introduces Alice to his friends at a house party, a fellow guest stands beside her, ignoring her physical self and seeking out her online avatar on the screen of his phone. So this is what we see in the novel in this scene. "This lady here," said Felix, "she writes books for a living, or so she claims." "What's your name?" the man asked. "I'll put it into Google." Alice watched this all unfold with a look of forced indifference. Alice's online trace brings her into existence in the real world, as the party guest, standing beside her, shares the screen of his phone, exclaiming, "Look at that, she's got a Wikipedia page and everything." The laptops and phones used by the characters in these contemporary Irish novels and poetry are not new or rare. If anything, it's their disarming familiarity which makes them notable. According to Bell, one of the reasons computers have been so readily accepted into our domestic spaces is the fact that, quote, "the computer still looks like a television and a typewriter. We welcome these machines because they bear the impress of previous genres." For now, at least, it remains the case that physical objects are needed to access cyberspace. Laptops, computers, tablets, and mobile devices, whether pocket-sized or desk-bound, are the physical things we touch in order to get access to the virtual world. The swiping of fingers and rotating of screens, the increasingly intuitive natural reactions interactions all place the body in contact with the machine as a portal to the imagination. Yet, as Castells points out, it's not the machines, but our responses to them that matters. Castells is resolute in his assertion that the information age has never been a technological matter and should be thought of instead as a process of social change in which technology is an element that is inseparable from social, economic, cultural and political trends. In the case of the Irish novels discussed in this lecture, it's most useful to think in terms of the levels of intimacy characters create with their machines and between each other via their machines. The Consul emerges here as a site of consolation in Irish fiction, providing moral support, distraction, and escapism. In other words, a comforting alternative to the limitations of the physical. Thank you very much.
Claire, thank you. Thank you so much for this fantastic lecture. Before we move on to questions, and I've already seen that Lance Pettit already has, watching us on YouTube, has a query about some of the points you've said, but I'd just like to remind people that to look for Hadissa on the chat for instructions on how to get the certificates of attendance. So that should be popping up on the YouTube chat for those who are interested in getting the certificates of attendance. So before I go back to Lance's point, I would just like to pick up on something you've just said from Bell, that about the similarities between the computer looking just like a TV and a typewriter, and something you've said about Beautiful World, which, by the way, for me was a great, one of the advantages of having this postponed is that you were able to include that brand new novel that's just come out, and I should say has been immediately translated into Portuguese. I think we had a simultaneous launch of both the English and the Brazilian version. So that is one of the things that's been happening in the editorial market. But my question to you, Claire, would be how the emails in that novel also look like letters, also work like letters do in epistolary novels. Mm-hmm. And if we could think of it as a sort of emailly novel in which we have these interactions happening, not via letter, but via email, and what that does to the novel, to the contemporary novel.
Yeah, thank you. That's a really good question. I think there's a mundane answer, again, isn't there, which is to say, of course, they send emails rather than letters.
Yeah.
Right? That although letters are extremely romantic and there would be, value in that, the practicalities of those two friends in the time and place in which they exist, wanting to communicate in length, means that they use emails. So one answer is to say, maybe as readers, as literary scholars, we apply some of the same thought processes that we would have to a novel shaped around letters that we now see in a novel shaped around emails. I think maybe the additional follow-on point from that is to think about why it is that the way in which these characters communicate in email is so obviously different from how they communicate in person. Yeah. And so, in the latest novel, I'm particularly interested in that, the way the formality and the complexity of their email exchanges, where there's a real kind of performative aspect to take on some of the themes of our day to day in those emails, whereas in the in-person exchanges, really, this could track for the three of Rooney's novels I discussed. As in real life, when characters meet face to face, people say the wrong thing, right? Or they're awkward, or the kind of tensions and jealousies between them distract from the content of the communication. So the email is some sort of alternative space where they can think carefully. That doesn't mean to say it's more authentic, but it is a space where they can express themselves. Yeah, and editable, exactly. Exactly.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Claire. Now, we still have some time for questions. I'm going to go back to look at the YouTube page, just in case we have any questions here already. Please type, folks, if you would like to ask us any questions, and I'll read them out to you. While we wait for this, Claire, I think there's a bit of a delay between our talking and the people asking the questions. I'm just going to go back to Lance's comment, which I originally mentioned. And Lance said he wasn't sure that the book, and I think he was still talking about normal people instead, that the point you made about it being a controlled outpouring, sort of like an email, he would like to hear more about that. He said he wasn't sure about that. So maybe if you could problematize that a bit.
Yeah, sure. I think it's an interesting, perhaps a generational question. So I think one of the points that Rooney often makes in interviews, for example, is that it's through the writing of email that in some way she learnt her writing craft. Right. So I think that controlled outpouring that she describes there in the Irish Times article speaks to a generation of Irish writers who, if you like, began by shaping an online profile on sites like MySpace and growing into writing very often blogs and personal essays and long email correspondences with friends, like the kinds of email exchanges we see in the novels. So, perhaps a point to make is that email operates in personal and professional spaces. So maybe the emails that we send to our colleagues are, more or less controlled outpourings, but certainly the emails that are described here and that become the template for the novel, I think, are these kind of personal exchanges between two close friends. Yes. So it's a kind of confessional space. It's a space in which prose is explored. It's not just the short exchange of WhatsApp messages or online messaging, which is a few lines, but something more developed, a kind of narrative that's growing as each message is exchanged. So, I think that it's, I think if we take it in that context, I think it's a, and I suppose the truly important point to respond to Lance's question is that that's how Rooney is describing her writing. So whatever we might think, she is thinking of her email voice as her novelist voice.
Yeah.
And that's a fascinating thing.
Yeah. And I would say also the element of competition that goes on in there, and the showing off as well, in terms of the skill, which is something we find in epistolary exchanges as well. We have a question here from Paige, which has been posted. Paige Reynolds, who was here, well, not here, but who was in Florianopolis.
We're all here. Yeah.
We're all here. Who was in Florianopolis, because I'm in Belo Horizonte myself, who was in Florianopolis back in 2019 when I myself was in Toronto. Claire is saying, she's thanking you. She's saying, Claire, fantastic paper. What do you make of the physiological responses to such technologies? A bit like the mom in Girl, neurological studies demonstrating these technologies and their consolations are physically addictive. Sorry.
Addictive. Yeah, that's a very good question also. I think when I've done some work on this before, I think that it's the kind of the addictive nature and the kind of tendency towards the censoring of video games because of the threat of addiction, or the fear that we have that the content of games will be distressing or problematic.
Video nasties all over again.
Exactly. And so we see equivalents of this in different genres and for all generations of media. And I think when you look at the history of video games, it's very interesting because this begins at the beginning of video games when the graphics, for example, are so basic that if there is anything potentially traumatic, it can only truly be in the imagination of the player, right? Because these are often a couple of pixels moving on the screen, but the pixels might represent, you know, as in the early games, kind of cars crashing into grannies, but there's nothing on the screen that shows you that. That's just in the imagination of the player. I would like to take Paige's question further and say that where we end up in talking about these intense email exchanges, that maybe there's something equally addictive or obsessively attractive about that. So when we think of Conall and Marianne in normal people, they can't separate themselves from one another. And partly what they can't separate from is the attraction of this correspondence.
Yeah.
You know, it's shown as being absolutely the kind of addiction that we perceive as a threat of video games. They can't stop writing to one another, and they can't stop performing themselves in these emails in the way they want to be perceived by the other. So, you know, I think the core idea could take us in really interesting directions.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Claire. Unfortunately, we won't have time for further questions, but you can also talk to us and send us messages, and I'll make sure that they get to Claire and she'll be able to answer, and I'll be happy to relay.
Yeah, and I'll be around
as well.
today, so that's great. Yeah,
fantastic.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Claire. Thank you all. It's been an absolute pleasure again. We read your book with great interest, and now this is an update of so much that has come out, and even stuff that's been published just this year. So thank you so much for that. We'll take a little short break before people set up the panels, and we'll be right back with the first student panel. Thank you again, Claire, and thank you. Okay, folks, we're having a few glitches here, and I'm just going to ask you for your patience for a second while Janaina gets ready. Janaina, let me know if you're ready, and I'll pass it on
ready,
to you.
Rita.
Okay,
Thank
fantastic.
you so much. Thank you. Right, so welcome everyone to the first panel of the Quinta Jornada do Núcleo de Estudos Irlandeses Da Ufsc. This panel is entitled Irish Theatre and Technology, and our first panelist is Alinne Fernandes. Alinne Fernandes is a tenured professor at the Federal University of Santa Catarina, Ufsc. She is the vice director of Ufsc's postgraduate program in English and coordinator of both Irish Studies, NEI, and Feminist Studies in Literature and Translation Research clusters. Fernandes has translated a number of plays by Irish and Northern Irish playwrights, including Marina Carr's By the Bog of Cats, Mary Rafter's No Escape, among others. And next, we have Andrey Martins. He is a PhD candidate at the postgraduate program in English at Ufsc, under the supervision of Dr. Rita Viana, who is here with us. And he's currently a visiting researcher at the University of California, Berkeley. And our final panelist is Melina Savi. She is a CAPES postdoctoral research fellow at the postgraduate program in English at Ufsc. She completed her PhD in 2018, in which she analyzed 3 novels by American author Ursula K. Le Guin in light of the current debates on the Anthropocene. So Alinne, the floor is yours.
Okay, just please just give me a second. I need to upload my presentation. Just sharing my screen. Okay. So my title is Creating Radio Drama in Times of Social Distancing, Irish-Brazilian Connections. Good morning, everyone, and thanks for attending this session today. I'm going to talk about the development of my most recent research project that involves the dramaturgical study, translation, and production of Irish and Northern Irish plays in radio drama format, as part of the soon-to-be-created sound digital archive of the Núcleo De Estudos Irlandeses. The motivations for starting such a project derives from 2 main sources of impetus. First, the COVID-19 pandemic itself, which has been a major backlash against the arts all over the world, but especially in Brazil, where there have been major cuts in the cultural and artistic industries. Although this crisis precedes the pandemic itself, I argue that the crisis has been aggravated by the pandemic as a result of course, social distancing, a lingering economic crisis, and so on. As paradoxical as this may sound, this grim context has been stimulating in terms of thinking about and developing alternative forms of artistic expression. Second, the play My Name, Shall I Tell You My Name? And I'll stick to my name from now on when referring to the play, was originally written for the radio and produced in 1987 by BBC Radio 4, and only afterwards received a stage production. From 2015 until 2019, I worked on the translation and staging of a number of plays by Irish and Northern Irish women playwrights that dealt with issues revolving around different forms of institutionalized violence. Reid's play was the last one of my corpus. And instead of concluding my former project by staging My Name, a project that came to a halt because of the pandemic, My Name ended up paving the way for a new beginning. But before moving on with my discussion on radio drama itself, I'll brief you about the play. My Name was written by Northern Irish playwright Christina Reid,
who was born in 1942 and died in 2015. My name is a troubles play. Jordan invites define troubles plays as those that are occupied with contentious ideologies, sectarianism, breaches of human rights, the sinister actions effectively sanctioned by the state, the intransigence of some political sensibilities, and the lingering influence of paramilitary organizations and their associated criminal elites. Although my name doesn't deal with the conflict directly, it most certainly addresses the effects of the conflict in the characters' lives, their mindsets, their prejudices, their beliefs, and the traumas that they live with. The play is in duet format. We have two characters on stage, and although they don't interact with each other, except for a brief scene in which there's a flashback, all of their lines are interwoven. They share the same memories, but from different perspectives. Andy remembers things as a 93-year-old man who is very Protestant, a First World War veteran, an ardent loyalist, who also considers himself more British than the British. Andrea, on the other hand, doesn't really buy the bigotry on which Andy dwells. She is in her mid-20s and has moved to England to pursue a new life, distant, or so she thinks, from the ideological divide that she grew up with. The play is set in 1986. Andy speaks from an old people's home in Derry, Londonderry, whereas Andrea speaks from a prison cell in Holloway Prison, London. So they're both in isolation and revisiting the experiences that have set them apart. And Andrea had moved to England to study. She entered a romantic relationship with a half Pakistani, half English man named Hanif and had a child with him. All of those aspects of Andrea's life are problematic to her grandfather, Andy. But the fact that Hanif isn't pure race is the real last straw. Andy is in an old people's home because he has no one to look after him. And Andrea is in prison for hanging out with her sister-in-law at the Women's Peace Camp at the Greenham Common. She wasn't actively engaged in the protests against the Falklands War and the testing of nuclear weapons, but her imprisonment leads her to reflect on her own apathy towards human rights, political causes, and the shattering effect of bigotry in people's affected lives. Now, back to the radio. So I started to study radio drama and explore its possibilities together with my outreach project group, which in 2020 had 3 members, including myself and 2 actors. One of them is my colleague, Matthias Garces, also a lecturer at Ufsc, and the other is Mariana Barreiros, a brilliant acting student who's currently based in Salvador, Bahia. I concluded the first draft of my translation of the play into Brazilian Portuguese last August, began rehearsals with Mariana, still unsure of who would play Andy. Everything happened via Google Meet, by the way. Later in September, I decided to invite Matthias to come on board. We retook rehearsals and Mariana now had a partner. We still didn't feel ready to adapt the translation for the radio at that stage, but we felt the need to test what we were doing. So we organized the digital rehearsed reading of the play on Google Meet, bearing in mind the limitations and possibilities but mostly limitations of the medium. We took a break, and in February, we were awarded a small but very important grant that enabled us to include a sound designer and editor to our group, Lara Roncalho, who's a cinema studies undergraduate student. Together with Lara came Cristel Casagranda, who's working voluntarily on the play's theme music. We started the recording process in July. Matthias and I worked on campus using the sound lab available at the Vibration and Acoustics Lab that is part of the mechanical engineering department, as we couldn't use the one available at our own center due to sanitary restrictions. Mariana had to create an improvised studio in her apartment in Salvador and do the recordings on her own. Lada got the pieces together and edited the recording, adding sound effects and the play's theme music. After Lada's editing work, we got a pilot version of the play and made it available for the public for a few days during the 16th Symposium of Irish Studies in South America, organized by the Brazilian Association of Irish Studies, ABE. Although set in the 1980s in both Northern Ireland and England, the play resonates with some of the most pressing issues of our times. To start with, doing audio drama in the 21st century is, to a certain extent, an act of resistance. In an era that relies heavily on the visual on the visual appeals of the instant TikTok videos, Instagram stories, and the addictive scrolling down of photos of perfectly happy Instagram and Facebook users, working on a production that relies exclusively on sound is challenging because one has to inform an audience on how to stop to listen and really focus on the experience of listening. On the other hand, the pandemic has seen a soaring consumption of podcasts, which reveals that there is an audience eager to consume audio products. The YouTube transmission of the pilot version of the play came with a written announcement instructing listeners to go to a quiet place and listen to the play with eyes shut and using headphones for a better enjoyment of the sound effects. And the play itself opens with the voice of a presenter inspired by old times radio and still used nowadays. Just check RTE Drumond 1 and you have loads of samples of that. Sound is so omnipresent in our lives that we take it for granted. Hand and Trainer lament the fact that, and I quote, "Because it is literally invisible, sound is all too easy to ignore." Tim Crook, writing in 1999, argued that, and I quote, "Radio drama has been one of the most unappreciated and understated literary forms of the 20th century." The very first plays written specifically for the radio in Europe date back to the 1920s. What they achieved that was different from simply transmitting live plays via the electrophone was that their scripts and overall productions sought to make the most of the medium itself. Radio drama has been described as blind, invisible, and dark. All those terms can be read as pejorative, downplaying the literary and aesthetic value of radio plays. The notion of a radio play as blind, for example, is probably due to the fact that it came after the theatre, which is a visual form of art. But both Crook and Hand Trainer argue that it isn't blind, but a different way of seeing. Philosophically speaking, when listening to radio plays, one, instead of seeing physically with the eye, sees with the mind. The notion of radio as invisible is also problematic, as the radio ends up competing with whatever we're doing. The radio is commonly background noise, thus not the primary focus of our attention, but a secondary, sometimes even a tertiary one. Throughout the history of radio drama, some conventions have been developed so as to catch hold of the listener's attention. One of them is narrative structure, which usually involves few characters, and the use of descriptive language, which can be embedded either in the lines of the narrator or in dialogues and monologues. Let's take a look at, for instance, the opening lines of My Name. After reciting a poem Andy had taught Andrea, Andy speaks in voiceover, taking us some 23 years back, trying to persuade Andrea to take her first steps as a toddler. Andrea then enters stage, between scare quotes, and stays there where she is, she says where she is and what year that is. She describes her memory by saying, "It's my earliest memory, stumbling into his arms, sitting on his knee, mimicking the last word of each line of that poem, the love in his voice, the delight in his face." Although these lines are from the published play script, which derives from the stage version of the play, they were originally written for the radio and thought through as a description of Andrea's memory, the action is not performed before our eyes, but enacted by means of the words that are spoken. And if I still have time, I would like to just play a short bit of the pilot version of our play. Just a second. Okay. Getting back to my presentation. I need to conclude the many ideas I know that I've thrown at you today, but I do hope to have enticed you to listen to radio plays. I'm going to wrap up with a very intriguing citation. How can we escape from this new noise that is adding to the distractions of an already complex world? Is it to be yet another byproduct of man's inventive mind, which will get beyond his control before he has learned its power? Although it sounds like this new noise is the internet, Hilda Matheson, who pioneered the BBC radio talks, was reflecting on the radio in 1933. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Alinne, for this fascinating talk about your project involving radio drama. And we look forward to hearing more about this project. Now let's listen to Andrey's discussion on Brian Friel's play. So, Andrey.
Good morning, everyone. Well, the title of my presentation and the work which I'm going to present here today is Laboring in Dancing, Brian Friel's Melancholic Carnival in Dancing at Lughnasa, which is a play that we studied in our Irish studies group at Ufsc. And back at the time, I had this idea because there is a moment in the play in which he really clearly is trying to draw a connection with the concept of carnival. But then though this work became more complex, and so what I'm going to try to do here is a triangulation between Brian Friel, his influence by Yeats, and the two philosophers. Okay, so Brian Friel's Dancing at Lughnasa uses dramatic form to reassess the main dichotomies of national identity ever since the Irish literary revival. Framed within the space and time of a character's reminiscence, the eruptions of frenzied dance in the otherwise bleak reality of the play do not only renew the force and vitality of a childhood memory, but by means of a complex web of associations, despite the idealization involved in the important endeavor such as W.B. Yeats to find a common ground for identity in the Celtic past of the country, the recourse to a bygone mythical era of this type of national project emerged out of a continuous concern with the ushering of a different future. As the poet writes in Ireland in the Arts, quote, "The Celtic movement, as I understand it, is principally the opening of this fountain, and none can measure of how great importance it may be to coming times, for every new fountain of legends is a new intoxication for the imagination of the world. As would become pronounced later in his career, such a recourse to the past was mediated by the necessity to tackle the hegemony of technology in modern life. And in this regard, especially in his theater, Yeats would embed folkloric themes in the latest avant-garde forms and technologies of dramatic production. As Gregory Castle writes, when Yeats reimagined the story of Cuchulainn, he sought a new pathway through technological modernity. In Brian Friel's play, which not coincidentally turns its attention to the 1930s, these apparently opposite poles of modernity, technology, and the primitive revealingly fuse into one another as the radio, the manifestation of latest technological development, is sustainably depicted as enjoying a primitive force. Quote, my Aunt Maggie wanted to call it Lugh after the old Celtic god of the harvest. In light of this, I'd like to explore how, far from an uncomplicated celebration of repressed paganism, the text of Friel's play opens itself to a nuanced diagnosis of the role of technology in such a way that it reveals how the primitive and modernity are dialectically constituted rather than exclusive of one another. That connection is particularly strengthened by the convergence of the arrival of the radio with that of the narrator's uncle from abroad. Quote, about 3 weeks before we got that wireless, my mother's brother, my uncle Jack, came home from Africa for the first time, unquote. And a surprising insight into fundamental dynamics of modernity, this identification merges two modalities of fetishism at the core of modern capitalism, the fetishism of the colonized other and the fetishism of the commodity. So, set in the summer of 1936, dancing at Lughnasa is structured around brief moments of happiness in a household of 5 Donegal sisters before industrialization, which looms in the background, fragments the family. The settling of the new factory in Ballybeg irrevocably changes the landscape of work relations in the Irish countryside. As manual glove knitting, the main source of income of Agnes and Rose, becomes as obsolete as the radio will be one day. However, by focusing on the moments when the wireless set was able to deliver its promise of liberation, the capacity of the technological artifact to cause the eruption of a new temporality is reenacted and indeed recollected within the temporality proper to the stage. Instead of the eventual deployment of technology as a disciplinary device to subdue the body, by recreating the experience of the artifact in the temporality proper to memory, as though in a Proustian reminiscence, the play tries to unearth the possibilities to liberate movement from mimesis of which the radio might be the occasion. No wonder then that the other stage props to which the play resorts are mainly toys, since the latter hold a ludic magical grip over the imagination of children, even as the radio enchants the 5 women into their Dionysian dance. Michael tells the audience, I remember my first delight and did my awe at the sheer magic of the radio. In order to understand the charged meaning that the radio as technological artifact assumes in the play, and why it is paradoxically most potent when delivering an experience which seems to embody the opposite of modernity as primitive dancing, the work of Walter Benjamin is especially appropriate, particularly attuned to how objects might decipher phenomena for the interpretation of concealed social processes, or how in fact the most modern and up-to-date object might reflect the persistence of the archaisms of the society that produced it. Benjamin's interest on objects in their historical articulation makes his thought a cogent and sustained reflection on how technology shapes human perception. Technology, however, must be understood in the broader sense, since even magical formulas, insofar as they are devices meant to intervene and control nature, might be understood as devices for domination, even as mimetic behavior among animals as a means of self-preservation might be understood as a primitive form of technology. Although the philosopher never properly spoke of reification, his thesis that commodities possess a mythical substratum could be understood in light of that notion. Roughly speaking, the concept of reification consists in claiming that the abstraction from the material process proper to capitalist production erases the historical character and intelligibility of objects by turning them into impenetrable, atemporal, nature. As invariable, faithful structures proper to mythological thought remains operative within capitalist production, commodities mirror the fetishes which they are meant to supersede by being, for example, as work done under oppressive conditions, not so much signs of freedom, but as it were expressions and signs of congealed fear, embodiments of fear. Thus, to review the archaic substratum of the products of modern technology could be simply summarized as the task of being sensible enough to perceive how objects, in being mute and non-subjective, reflect that which is inexpressible and impenetrable in the very workers themselves, namely trauma. And insofar as trauma is a disease of memory, it becomes a historical phenomenon asking for articulation. Thus, to unfold the archaic within the modern means to use technology to release the memory of suffering that the product might express and signify insofar as it is a manifestation of dominated nature, a manifestation that by the process of reification is nonetheless repressed and mystified by the very logic of economic exchange. Moreover, philosophers such as Benjamin, Adorno, and Kristeva identify in this return of the archaic a resurgence of mimesis, semblance, and non-linguistic semiosis, by which reason rationality attempts to cure the wound it made on nature in order to make it signify. Quote, the fundamental problem of art is that it is the critique of reification by way of reification, unquote. Benjamin, in turn, in a rather provocative passage writes, quote, were this exploitation to come to a halt, work in turn could no longer be characterized as the exploitation of nature by man. It would henceforth be conducted on a model of children's play. And since we are talking about theater here, play has we could see this other dimension of the word play. To have instituted play as the canon of a lay, no longer rule exploitation is one of the great merits of Friel, unquote. By the same token, we could say that what is most interesting about how technology is handled in Dancing at Lughnasa is that it momentarily envisions a hybrid modernity, surprisingly Yeatsian in conception, in which technology becomes for a moment the very means for the liberation of the motility of the body through music and dance, although it is a liberation bound up with destruction, the expenditure or wasting that of energy. Friel is conscious of the force of non-linguistic semiosis, and at his most philosophical, he concludes Dancing at Lughnasa by having Michael, the character of Michael, say, quote, when I remember it, I think of it as dancing with eyes half closed, because to open them would break the spell, dancing as if language had surrounded to movement, dancing as if language no longer exists, because words were no longer necessary. So here now is the Yeatsian part of the work, since I'm a Yeatsian myself. Dancing at Lughnasa pivots around the dichotomy between repressive Catholicism and Celtic paganism that, as we saw, can be traced to the Irish literary revival, and particularly, for example, the work of Yeats. Yeats, in particular, was responsible for discovering in the folklore, legends, and religion of the people of the Irish countryside the traces of that universal religion, which, along with Blake, he believed perfectly manifested in art. In contrast to the Catholicism that for centuries had been guilty of cutting art from its vital dependence in popular forms, this Sligo poet found in Celtic culture an original indistinction between art and religion, the retrieval of which he believed would galvanize modern art. In the Celtic element in literature, for example, he writes, quote, men who live in a world where anything might flow and change, worship nature and the abundance of nature, and had always, as it seems, for a supreme ritual, that tumultuous dance among the hills or in the depths of the woods, where unearthly ecstasy fell upon the dancers until they seemed the gods or godlike beasts. Further, in an essay such as Ireland and the Arts, he makes a call for poets to choose a subject matter of composition, stories and themes drawn from their own erased cultural heritage, for this practice would strengthen their connection with the universal spirituality embedded in pagan religion, and be harbinger of a future revitalized by a cultural revolution. It's no surprise then that Yeats' first great poetic achievement The Wanderings of Uiscin, is framed as dialogue between St. Patrick, which represents Catholic Ireland, and the Fenian warrior. We should not forget that the inhabitants of the Immortal Islands are described as living in an eternal dance, which moreover is upheld as the threatening deluge of pagan joy in contrast to the repressiveness of the Christian God. Yeats's mythical Ireland, nonetheless, was heavily influenced by the intellectual milieu of the 19th century, since in Ireland and the arts, the Greek people are elected as the only people besides the Celtic to have achieved the type of religious and artistic spirituality that he praised, as can already be glimpsed by his observation concerning the tragic quality of the religion of the Celtic and his very prophecy of a new tragic age. His celebration of this aesthetic religion was deeply influenced by Nietzsche's celebration of the Dionysian. The paganism that plays such an important role in Yeats and finds its way into the imaginary of Friel's play is fashioned out of a synthesis of Celtic folklore and a hope for a deluge of Dionysian forces, a return of the dismembered god, or a second coming, the uncontrollable movement of a violent gyre, which in Friel's play lays hold of people by the spell of radio waves. In this regard, the great aesthetic merit of Dancing at Lughnasa explores the disruptive potential of the Dionysian forces from the perspective of its theatrical possibilities. As attention to the stage directions show, the play is particularly sensible to the motif of the mask, as when, for instance, Maggie is described as turning to a crude mask of happiness while she dances. Here, dance is a practice capable of disrupting the order of reality by staging the hidden skin of its constitutive mimetic component. Although the beautiful simplicity of the play never lets this component turn to an exaggerated metalinguistic statement. Especially for the purpose of this page, revealing how the outbursts of dance are described in a language evocative of carnivalesque disruption. We read in the play, with this too loud music, this pounding beat, this shouting, calling, singing, this parodic reel, there is a sense of order being consciously subverted, of the women consciously and crudely caricaturing themselves, indeed of near hysteria being induced. This passage clearly draws from the language used to depict the concept of carnival, developed by Mikhail Bakhtin and popularized in Western Academy by Julia Kristeva in the 60s and 70s. What is revealing about Kristeva's approach is that although she mobilizes the Dionysian in her articulation of the flooding of the semiosis constitutive of the signifying process, which moreover emerges from bodily motility, is that the angle of her way of broaching the subject enlightens its connection with technology and modern labor. As John Margarone writes in his introduction to her thought, at the end of the first part of her doctoral dissertation, she attempts a convergence between the factory and the theater, the world of labor and the world of representation. Like Walter Benjamin, Kristeva tries to explain this often paradoxical juxtaposition of the primitive and technology, and thus might help us draw out the emancipatory core of Yeats or Friel's recourse to the Dionysian without falling prey to mystifications. For in its staging of a use of technology that does not hurt the body, Dancing at Lughnasa, if we agree with Harold Bloom that the meaning of a poem is another poem, might be said to be wholly contained in the celebrated last stanza of Yeats' poem Among School Children. Labor is blossoming or dancing where the body is not bruised to pleasure soul. Thank you.
Thanks, Andrey, for this insightful view regarding Brian Friel's play. And now we have Melina. Melina, the floor is yours.
Hello, thank you. So first of all, good morning. I don't have a PowerPoint. You're gonna have to stare at me. So as Janaina said, my name is Melina Savi, and I'm looking at Stacey Gregg's play Override and arguing that it can be read as a science fiction work that illuminates how we have come to see ourselves, the humans, as non-human, in that we are no longer only biological beings, but geological agents, capable of altering the biophysical structures of the planet. I'll begin with a very short summary of the play. It overrides the dystopian science fiction play written by Northern Irish playwright Stacey Gregg, published in 2013 by Nick Hearn Books. A pregnant young couple that chooses to live off the grid in an overwhelmingly technological world steadily explore the question, what does it mean to be human? Or even, what are the limits to what one considers to be a human? The play has 2 acts and 2 characters, Violet and Mark. Violet, who has been enhanced by a type of technology that was developed to fix disabilities, but was put to other uses in a hyper-consumerist society, reveals to her techno-purist partner that she has undergone a number of techno fixes and augmentation procedures. First to fix a lazy eye, then in order not to miss out on the tech novelties, and as a bet on social mobility. Mark, himself an administrator inherited to the company that created these fixes and augmentations, overrides Violet's settings, and without her consent, it should be noted, shutting off in her anything that is not human. What happens next is the depiction of Violet's transition from being human to a decaying machine and having a miscarriage in the process, and finally to her existence as virtual reality alone. V, as Mark calls her, becomes a metal box, with which Mark, who loves and misses her, learns to accommodate to, thus expanding the limits to what entails a human to him. With V's mind stored inside a box, Mark resorts to augmentations himself to be able to interact with her in virtual reality. In their lives prior to their moving to this walled-off community, V and Mark had experienced the world in sharply different ways. Mark comes from a wealthy intellectual family, while V comes from a working class family and is referred to by Mark's relatives as earthy. Mark, as heir to the tech empire that first promoted the fixes and augmentations to then ban them once it became apparent that these technologies gave people too much power, believes to occupy a high moral ground when it comes to technologies on people's bodies. No hard tech in a soft body was the slogan of one of the protests the couple went to before the banning of fixes and augmentations. V, on the other hand, from the start calls out on the fragility of any attempt to hold on to a definition of oneself as either or, human machine, moral immoral, right wrong, thus setting the ground for the discussion of the dichotomy that is at the core of the either or debate, the nature culture one. Here I'll briefly discuss one idea that connects the play with the current debates on the epoch of the Anthropocene. The technological societal disruption Gregg imagines can be associated with the disruptions of the Anthropocene, with climate change as its most prominent facet, and the 6th great extinction, air pollution, ocean acidification, and other anthropogenic effects that are equally worrying and terrifying along with them. The social impacts of these climatic and geophysical disruptions are affecting and will affect, first and most aggressively, those who are already most vulnerable. The Anthropocene is the not yet official term to define the current geological epoch, marked by the visible presence of the actions of humans on the rocks, on the stratigraphic records that the geological sciences utilize in order to determine the transitions between eras, periods, and epochs. In the Anthropocene, the human, this impossible to define category, transitions from biological being to geological agent. The marks of human actions on this world lay on the stratigraphic records in a way that is comparable to the most remarkable moments of the planet, such as when the meteor that is believed to have led the dinosaurs to extinction hit the Earth around 66 million years ago, or when the greatest volcanic eruptions released their might and carbon dioxide onto the atmosphere. The precise moment when our epoch transitions from the Holocene, which is marked by stable weather that allowed us to develop agriculture and to migrate across the globe, into the Anthropocene, is still under discussion. The Anthropocene Working Group of the Subcommission on Quaternary Stratigraphy has raised at least 3 possible golden spikes, each of which represent a moment when there was a significant enough change in the way humans carried their actions across the globe, significant enough to leave its mark on the rocks, on the strata. One of these spikes is called the Great Acceleration Period, which starts on July 16, 1945, when in Alamogordo, New Mexico, the first nuclear bomb was detonated. From this date, 1945, to 1988, we humans detonated one bomb every 9.6 days. The fallout resulting from these explosions can be clearly identified in chemostratigraphic records, the way in which we write our history on the rocks. More than an epoch, the Anthropocene has become a hallmark of how disruptive, in material and subjective terms, our human endeavors can turn out to be. Although Gregg's play is not about climate change or the sixth mass extinction, it tackles the grief that comes with the profound societal changes, and the subjective ones too, that our actions can lead to. What has led us to name an epoch after us could be, in a sense, our understanding of the misuses of technology. I mean, what justifies the detonation of more than 2,000 atomic bombs on the surface and underground over the course of 40 years? For the benefit of whom are war technologies developed and deployed? One of the most interesting aspects of Gregg's play rests in the representation of characters who occupies two sides of this equation. One that only in terms benefits from pushing war technologies, and one that is subjected to them. And both are overtaken with grief. In the disrupted world they live in, nature and culture collide in ways that allow for the exploration of how this dichotomy plays into grief and into nostalgia for a natural world that is no longer. Yet another aspect to consider is the implication of the genre to which the play belongs, science fiction. As a sci-fi play, Override is inserted in a speculative terrain that ponders, among other things, what is not yet. Joanna Ross, drawing on Samuel R. Delaney's distinction between fiction, fantasy, and science fiction, proposes that sci-fi is about what hasn't happened. Differently from fiction, in which a writer explores what has or could have happened in terms of plausibility, and from fantasy, in that a writer contemplates what cannot happen according to the laws of physics, sci-fi belongs to the terrain of possibility, of things that haven't happened yet, but whose possibilities are not yet discarded by our knowledge of what is possible. A dystopia, which is often a subgenre of sci-fi, Ross puts forth, often involves what an author hopes to prevent. The new coronavirus pandemic has made technology a staple of contemporary life in most of the world, with some carrying over their entire professional activities to virtual interactions. Bearing in mind Ross's argument that a sci-fi reader, and I quote, judges the science fictionalness of what happens by what he himself knows of the actual world, encountering a play like Gregg's in a context of exponentially increased technological mediation, it sounds only plausible that very soon the technology we currently and externally rely on will come to inhabit our bodies. In many ways, and for many people, it already does. A final parallel can be made with sci-fi and the Anthropocene and what the latter implies for the present and the future. In this new epoch, the human is no longer only a biological being, but a geological agent. And this new and collective understanding of oneself is bound to lead to a cognitive disconnect. As Dipesh Chakrabarty puts forward, and I quote, we can become geological agents only historically and collectively. That is, when we have reached numbers and invented technologies that are on a scale large enough to have an impact on the planet itself, end of quote. We are already the result of science fictions of the past. And Chakrabarty himself is suspicious of the exceedingly inclusive notion of humankind in its failure to explain who is the human behind the economic practices that have led us to become the driving geological force of the Anthropocene, or even which humans in which economies have contributed more or less to the predicament we find ourselves in. He poses that the actions of humans that lead to global warming, such as the burning of fossil fuel, industrialization of animal stock, the clearing of tropical forests, and so on, are not isolated events, but are deeply rooted in what has become of Western capitalism. In Override, one witnesses the critique of the economic paradigm which drives consumption of a technology to the point where, one, people lose sight of the effects of their actions. Two, they experience a profound cognitive disconnect, as is the case with Mark, who can't truly understand the impact of his family's technology business. And three, one engages in an examination of the human as a far from universalizing category. V, in embodying the cyborg who destabilizes Mark's understanding of what is a human, calls attention to the cognitive disconnect we have long been engaged in seeing ourselves, humans, as disconnected from nature, the hallmark of the nature-culture dichotomy. Given that the context Gregg explores is highly technological, one might presume that the story takes place in the future. But as we are somehow always expecting the future to be ever more technological than it is at present. The stage directions, however, instruct dramaturgs and readers that the setting should be designed to be ambiguous. It could lean into the 60s or 90s, but it should not be futuristic. Technology-inspired decor in a society that is striving toward technological advancement is nothing new, of course. Futurism came hand in hand with the space race or the Star Wars apocalypse, as Harry puts it in the Cyborg Manifesto, that marked the post-war and Cold War period. The nostalgia in the setting of Gregg's play is therefore telling of an anxiety over the extreme and almost invisible integration of technology with everyday life, to the point of V being able to pass as a tech-free body in a community of purists. Susan Sontag explores this anxiety already in 1965 in the essay One Culture and the New Sensibility, where she ponders the effects of science and technology in the arts. In fact, calling out on the ineffective tendency to see these two realms as in clash. The essay was actually meant to criticize the excessive distinctions between high and low culture, somewhat attacking the conception of the literary arts as supreme, but she criticizes the understanding that technology moves forward, progresses, while the arts remain static. She was also criticizing the expectation that technology, in representing the new, the low, had to be somehow shunned by the purest realms of the arts. We'd be either stuck with the low or locked in the predicament of nostalgia. Those who can see the world for what it is and not for what it ought to be can, Susan Sontag reasons, find powerful ways to integrate both high and low, the technological and the artistic, and thus inhabit the unsettling position of not being either or. So humans are now faced with the cognitive disconnect of feeling like biological beings and being biological agents. While Mark resists the reality of the world he inhabits, V embraces the chaos of ingrained technology, of the confusion of human and non-human boundaries, and refuses to accept any purist notion of what we ought to be. In the Anthropocene, we are already geological agents, and we are also biological beings. So I argue that this is an opportunity to enlarge our notion of what it means to be human and expand this understanding to finally acknowledge that we are not and have never been the humans we often think we are. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Melina, for this fantastic talk about Stacey Gregg's play. And I think we have time for questions. Let me see if we have some in the chat. Oh, right. So we have a question from Kathleen Rosa, and this is a question to Alinne. So Alinne, can you tell us more about the experience of working remotely with the actors for your project?
Hello, can you hear me okay?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I'm not using headphones, so I hope this works.
We can listen to you perfectly.
Thank you very much. I had technological problems earlier on with the transmission of the play itself, so sorry about that.
Okay, no, perfectly fine.
Kathleen, thank you very much for your question. Yeah, so I started rehearsals with Mariana Barreiros via Google Meet last year, and I suppose we were, kind of together, united by Google Meet. The three of us, Matthias, Mariana, and I, and I could direct the actors then. And I think that the real challenge, in spite of connection problems and everything, actually began when we started recording, because Mariana was still in Salvador and Matthias was here. So I was able to direct him at the lab. We were kind of separated by a very thick wall, but we could communicate via like a microphone, and so I could, interfere and ask him to repeat, and we do some of his lines, but I couldn't direct Mariana. So, but we have been working together for such a long period of time that she said that she kind of felt that she could hear my voice inside her head as she did the recordings herself. And she did like her lines 3 or 4 times and presented me with alternatives in case I didn't like her delivery of her lines. So she provided me with like 3 different versions of each line, so I could choose. When we kind of started working on the pilot version of the play. I'm sorry, did it answer your question?
I think so. Thanks, Alinne. Thank you so much. Well, I have a question to Melina. Melina, were there any moments in the play or specific moments that you feel that they had an impact on you? Because when I read the play, that really happened to me. So I'm just curious to know if the same thing happened to you.
Yes, I think so. I think I was very impacted by Violet's playfulness, in contrast with Mark, who's so serious. He's the cyborg in the play. But actually, she is the cyborg in the play if we think of Haraway's cyborg, right? But I was very impacted by her playfulness, how she inhabits all of the roles that she has in the play with such ease. And I was thinking that when I was reading the play, I would like to be more like her, so playful, so even optimistic, and having this view of humans as a splash of neurons, instead of as this very unique, idealized version of what a human ought to be, And what about you?
Well, I think that to me, the fact that people were becoming cyborgs, as you said, it is a new notion. If to me, not a new notion, but it had an impact on me, because just to imagine and people having technological material in themselves, but this happens already in reality. So at the same time, it was kind of like an impact, but at the same time, I realized, well, we already have this. I already have this. So
yes, we have extensions.
So this is interesting.
We have our phones.
We do have
of our heads.
We do have it. Even our glasses. Like I wear glasses, so it's already an extension of technology in my body, helping my body. So I think that the play raises an interesting discussion for our modern times. Thank you so much, Melina. And I think our time's up. So, Beatriz has a question. All right. Is it in the YouTube? Okay, I'm just locating the question. Just a second. Mm-hmm. All right. So we have a question from Beatriz, and this is for Melina. So great. Yes. Thank you, Harissa. So a great paper, Melina, and your research work on theater and the Anthropocene is fascinating. Override will be included in Cia Luden's next cycle of readings, Irish Theater and Physical Disability. So these are great news, definitely.
Thank you, Beatriz. Thank you so much. And that's absolutely wonderful news.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Beatriz, for sharing that with us. And so, yes, now our time is up. So I'd like to thank everyone who participated, who watched our panel. And now we're going to have a lunch break. And at 1 o'clock in Brazil, 4 o'clock in Ireland, 3 o'clock in Ireland, I'm not so sure, but we will have an interview with Stacey Gregg, right? So thank you so much.